Hi everybody, good morning. It is so great to be here with you today talking about cartoon maps of Canyonland. I learned so much yesterday listening to all of the wonderful different talks, and one thing that I was reminded of, it's not that I learned it, but I was reminded of it. I am definitely not a scientist or a cartographer, right? I'm a graphic designer and graphic design historian, and I stand in awe of all of the real cartographers and scientists out there. And I hope that you will enjoy a little change of pace with me this morning as we get started. Because essentially, I'm going to be telling you a story, and there are lots and lots of pictures that we will be looking at as we tell this story as well. So once upon a time, we're not going to talk about how many years ago because I got depressed when I counted them. I was a PhD student here at Arizona State, and I was writing my dissertation about how professional graphic design and illustration practices had shaped popular cartography, basically during the first half of the 20th century. And as I was doing this research, as you can see, I was kind of staying away from the Grand Canyon as much as possible because so many amazing scholars had already written so much about the Grand Canyon that I was going to focus on other subjects instead. So I was looking at gold mines and Spanish missions and the Painted Desert, and you get the idea. If you wanted to read more about it, I wrote about it in a book. So anyhow, really early in this process, though, I discovered this image, this map. It's a 1935 cartoon map of the state of Arizona, and it's by a commercial cartographic illustrator named Ruth Taylor. And the map had been published in a book called Our USA, A Gay Geography. It was published by Little and Brown out of Boston in 1935. And it was illustrated by Ruth, and it was written by her brother Frank, and I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with the colors and with the stories and the way that every person and place was obviously so meticulously researched, and yet at the same time so absolutely stereotypical, and in many ways we would now say represented in a way that's culturally quite insensitive. Yet at the same time I was just in awe of Ruth Taylor. And I found out a little bit more about her, discovered that she was a divorced woman who had a really successful professional illustration practice in the 1930s. You'll meet her again in a few minutes. So as it turned out, there were tons of cartoon maps of the Grand Canyon, and even though I wasn't starting out to write about them in my dissertation, I couldn't avoid them. So I ended up writing a little bit about them. But really putting together this talk has been a welcome opportunity to revisit some famous images and to have an excuse to pull them all together and to focus on the Grand Canyon, even though nothing has changed. Lots of other really famous people have said really intelligent things about the Grand Canyon, but I've enjoyed revisiting these maps and thinking about the cultural context for these really, really specific images of the Grand Canyon. So why do they look the way they do? Who made them, and for what clients, for what audiences, and then perhaps most importantly, what stories do these maps tell us about the Grand Canyon, and what stories do they tell us about the stories we like to tell ourselves about the Grand Canyon, even today. So this is what we are going to be talking about this morning: cartoon maps of the Grand Canyon, their cultural contexts, the narratives that they communicate. I'm a teacher. I can't quite help myself. I decided I had to give you an outline. Apologies. But this is where we're going today. So the first context, the first way of understanding these maps is to look at the visual formats that influenced them and their aesthetic, the way that they look. There are three really important aesthetic or visual contexts that are key to understanding cartoon maps as a visual genre. And the first of these, as you probably have already guessed, are the illustrated atlas images. And we saw some of these yesterday. The illustrated atlas is a visual form with a really long cartographic history, but we're looking at three more recent examples that are really a lot closer to home for those of you who live here in Arizona or the Southwest. We have Clarence Dutton's 1882 Tertiary History of the Grand Canyon District, commissioned, as you all know, by the U.S. Geological Survey and illustrated by Thomas Moran and William Henry Holmes. We're also seeing the Arizona plate from Arbuckle's Illustrated Atlas of the United States of America. And Arbuckle's was a coffee company, and they commissioned these chromolithographic or color printed images as trade cards for inclusion in their coffee packaging. So they were sort of like the forerunner of our contemporary cereal box surprise toy in a way. They were designed to be collectible. You were supposed to want to keep them and possibly even hang them up as art in your home. And in 1889, Arbuckle's conveniently issued a commercially available atlas that included all of the maps in the set. And of course, you can see how they're surrounding Arizona with these really romanticized and ahistorical images of indigenous residents of Arizona. And then finally, we're seeing Antonio Garcia Cubas's 1887 Geographical and Statistical Atlas of Mexico, kind of on the far right of your screen. And you can see how the cartographic map is framed and surrounded by more pictorial images. So formal or visual characteristics that I want you to notice before we move on from the illustrated atlases. They're combining cartographic maps and illustrations into a single image. Though it might be compartmentalized, they're also composed really holistically as images. They're designed very carefully. The maps are often framed or surrounded by pictorial images, and then both typography and lettering can play a really important role. So words and images are working together to craft this message and to tell us a story. The second really important formal influence for cartoon maps is, of course, the bird's eye view map. So the map maker most associated with Arizona is C.J. Dyer, and we're seeing his map of Phoenix here. He was working throughout Arizona in the 1880s and the early 1890s, and this is his 1885-ish map of Phoenix. So bird's eye views were drawn primarily by itinerant map makers. They would travel around during the second half of the 19th century, and they would make drawings for these maps from live observation. So C.J. Dyer visited Phoenix, he went to all of these places, he sketched them from live observation, and then they would take all of these images back to a big city lithographer or printer, have the map printed, and finally folks who had subscribed to the map while the map maker was in town would receive their finished map. Accuracy was a really important consideration in making and selling these maps. So they're actually pretty decent historical records in a lot of cases. This 1862 news item from the Delphi Times sums it up really, really nicely. So that article describes a map that will show the roads, streams, durable springs, mills, schoolhouses, etc. It will contain such statistical matter as will make it useful to the citizens of the county, and great care will be taken to ensure the accuracy of the map. So homes and businesses get depicted in really high detail. You can find yourself on the map. You can find important buildings that are numbered and labeled. And the map is appealing because of civic pride and, frankly, because of personal vanity. So you can see things that you're familiar with, that you really love, possibly that belong to you. So it was a profitable venture in a lot of cases. One last description from a period newspaper describes the process really nicely. A. Ruger, an artist for the Chicago Lithographing Company, has sketched a very pretty bird's eye view of Centralia, showing all the streets and buildings. It is to be lithographed and printed in colors, and will make a useful as well as a beautiful picture. Every citizen of Centralia should possess one for its beauty and use as a map of the city, and also to encourage a work that will add to the already well-earned character and fame of our growing city. So of course, Centralia is so famous. I'm sure you've all been there and had lovely tourist experiences of the place. Before we move on from the bird's eye view map, just pointing out a few formal characteristics that we're going to see again when we get to our cartoon maps. An orthographic or three-quarter aerial view which is really popular with a lot of cartoon maps and almost all bird's eye view maps, because you can get both the landscape and the human characters in that landscape in a pretty high level of detail. There's lots of labeling going on here. Buildings are named, streets are named, and there's this real emphasis on color and aesthetics. These are beautiful and useful. They're supposed to seduce you into buying them. And then, of course, we can't talk about cartoon maps without talking about cartoons. So Richard Outcault's wildly successful Yellow Kid, who you're seeing in the top left-hand corner of your screen, and he's called the Yellow Kid because he's wearing a yellow nightshirt. It took me a while to figure that out, so I'll just share it with you. He's wearing a yellow nightshirt. And this comic introduced a lot of the things that we think of as so typical of comics today for the first time. So all the staples, speech bubbles, sequential panels, a recurring cast of characters, and we're also looking at some other really early examples of cartoon strips. And again, the way that they look is going to be very familiar to you when we advance to the cartoon maps of Arizona, because the Kensenjammer Kids, starting up in 1897, bringing up Father, which got underway in 1913, Grace Drayton's Dimples, which ran between 1914 and 1918. Grace Drayton is a lot more famous for the Campbell's Soup Kids, if you happen to know those. And then finally, on the far right, we're looking at James Swinnerton's Kitties of the Canyon Country, which ran in Good Housekeeping from 1922 to 1941. So it had a really long run, and as you're going to see, these round and chubby and happy little cartoon characters are going to turn up again, as will speech bubbles, and a recurring cast of characters. So the characters themselves really tend to be types or tropes. They're familiar, they're stereotypical, they're cartoons, and though they're detailed, they aren't particularly specifically individualized. And again, this is going to be familiar when we get to our cartoon maps of Arizona. So these three influences came together in America in the 1920s to form a popular new genre, the cartoon map. And there's this argument that the cartoon map was a British import, and American artists were first exposed to it through this image, which is by the British artist MacDonald Gill from 1914. And that image was reprinted on the front cover of a trade magazine in America in 1926. And there's, again, this theory that the cartoon map was imported into America at that time. However, this is an early American example of the form. It was drawn by Joe Squirrel in 1925 and published by the St. Paul Great Northern Railway Company a year earlier than MacDonald Gill's image was imported into America. So Squirrel may indeed have seen the Gill image. I can't tell you that he didn't, but he definitely didn't see it for the first time when it was printed in America, because his map here is earlier than that. So regardless of their origin story, where they came from, what was influencing them, these cartoon maps were really, really warmly received by public audiences of all different kinds. Since they were both cartoons and maps, they were generally described as education and amusement rolled into one, or much to see and much to learn, or, as the New York Times put it when they described Ruth Taylor's Our USA, quote, "These maps convey a great deal of accurate information, question mark, with the gusto of the funny papers." So those are the formal or visual sources for these cartoon maps of Arizona, but it's really important also to think about who made these images. And cartoon maps of the Grand Canyon were drawn by a small group of cartographic illustrators. Some of them were local to Arizona or the Southwest, some of them were working on a national scale, and they brought their own style and their own set of priorities to the images that they were making. So it's important to get to know them just a little bit, and I'm going to introduce you to a cast of characters and their maps, some of which you might already be familiar with, but some of which you might be seeing for the first time. So Joe Mora, of course, you probably know his name, perhaps, 1876 to 1947, attended art school and then established a commercial illustration practice in Boston as a young man. And then as an adult, he relocated with his family to the Southwest, and he just fell in love with the landscape of the Southwest. So as a painter and a sculptor and a cartographic illustrator, he had quite a successful career. He called his cartoon maps cartas, which is French for maps, and most of his cartographic work was really centered here in the Southwest. This is his 1931 Carta of the Grand Canyon with color added for a 1959 reprinting. And his son Joe Jr. actually traveled around the Southwest drumming up subscriptions for these maps, just like the itinerant cartographers of the previous century. So you can see how he was really inspired by, for instance, something like the Atlas of Mexico. He's framing this image. You can see a bit of that in the upper left-hand corner, where he frames the more cartographic map of the Grand Canyon with pictorial images. Ernest Dudley Chase was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, and so his Grand Canyon isn't quite as detailed or lovely in terms of all the stories that it's telling, but it's a beautiful map. You can see how he's really in love with this idea of labeling everything, a little bit like the Eric Gill image that we saw earlier. This is his 1940 America the Wonderland pictorial map of the United States. All of the maps that he made, no matter what the location, have these really bountiful labels that we're looking at. And again, because this is a map of the United States, we're not tightly focused on the Grand Canyon. We're just getting kind of an aerial view of it as an iconic tourist destination. Another cartographer / illustrator who really loved the Grand Canyon was Jolly Lindgren, 1895 to 1952. And he was born Elmer to his parents in Wisconsin, and then his family moved to Spokane, Washington later on, where he and his brother Oscar established the Lindgren Brothers Decal Printing Company in 1928. And they made these what they called hysterical maps, and so the point of them was to tell jokes about the landscapes that they were depicting. These were quite famous in their day. Maybe some of you have some at home. They're really lovely. The Lindgrens were also known for their souvenir decals of tourism destinations, so the stickers that you can buy and stick onto your stuff when you visit someplace like the Grand Canyon. They got in on that action very early in 1948, and they were very successful. So this is his 1940 hysterical map of Grand Canyon National Park. And as you can see, he's really fond of speech bubbles. So he's taking that from the cartoons that he may have encountered in newspaper strips, drawing on that visual tradition. We're going to come back to all of these maps and talk about the stories that they tell. We're just speeding through them as we get to know their illustrators. So this is Catherine Cahill, 1884 to 1962. I've never been able to locate an image of Catherine Cahill, but this is an artist who she depicts on her map, standing in for her. She studied in Los Angeles at the School of Illustration and Painting with William Cahill, whom she later married. And she mostly painted figures and landscapes. This is her only map. It's a 1933 map called Arizona Translated Little Springs, and we're zoomed in on the canyon in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. Her husband eventually moved to New York, and she decided that Arizona was a better place to be. I'm not sure I can blame her. So she relocated to Phoenix. She'd lived with her family in Globe before that, so she had some roots here in Arizona. Had a solo show at the Phoenix Arts Center in January 1941. And again, this is her only map. It was published in 1933, and it predates anything done by George Avey for Arizona highways. We're going to meet him in 2 more slides, except I'm sure you already know him and are familiar with his beautiful images. So possibly he had seen this and was kind of thinking about it as he got his pictorial cartography of Arizona underway. We can't skip our friend Ruth Taylor. She lived most of her life in San Francisco, where she was a successful practicing commercial artist. She had attended Stanford for a while as an English major, but then decided really she was an artist. She went to New York to study at the Institute of Art and Design, and she married Leonard White in 1919, and they moved to Phoenix, so she had some local roots here in Arizona as well. Eventually, she divorced Leonard and moved back to Northern California, where she continued to have an active career as a commercial illustrator. She called her maps cartographs. I really like that word. I think it works well. And she had significant success with them. But when I was finally able to visit the archive at Stanford and look at her papers, evidently her brother Frank reported that she got tired of doing maps all the time, which I found a little bit heartbreaking. But I was able to move on from that disappointment. Here we're seeing a detail from her Arizona map from Our USA, which, as you already know, was published in 1935. And she's done her research, right? She pictures a male weaver in Hopi Land, for instance, which is historically accurate, but at the same time, all of her characters are undeniably caricatures. So they're playing familiar roles in expected ways, and there's a real tension between those caricatures and the obvious level of research that she poured into what she was doing. You know George Avey, I would imagine, but this is his map of Arizona. Avey was the art director for Arizona Highways. His mother was an art teacher, and he studied art in high school. He studied architecture at university for a while, but then had to return home as the Great Depression started to have a really deep economic impact. By 1933, he was in the drafting office at the Arizona Highways Department, and he moved from there to take on art direction for Arizona Highways, the magazine, from 1938 to 1972. And so we're seeing here his 1942 map, Arizona Welcomes You. And Avey's are probably the most famous cartoon maps of Arizona. I'm pretty sure most of you have seen this image or one very much like it before. There are definite parallels with Catherine Cahill's site-specific narratives and with Ruth Taylor's visual style. All of these illustrators are participating in a broader visual culture that they're sharing with each other, and like artists always do, they're quoting each other and echoing one another. Don Bloodgood, 1896 to 1989, lived in Sedona from the 1960s onward, and like Joe Mora, he fell in love with the landscape of the Southwest. He was a really active commercial cartographic illustrator with big-name clients like Shell Oil. We're looking here at his Picture Guide map of Arizona, and like Ernest Dudley Chase, he's really, really fond of these textual labels, drawing on the tradition of bird's eye view maps, and every so often he'll use a speech bubble as well, often to tell a joke. And then last but not least, Reg Manning, another Arizona native, 1905 to 1986. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial cartoonist for the Arizona Republic, where he hired on in 1926 and remained until the end of his career. His family moved to Phoenix when he was a teenager, and he took art in high school, and this was his only formal artistic training. But in 1938, he wrote the Cartoon Guide to Arizona, and it included this beautiful map that we're seeing a detail of here. He's indebted to cartoons for all of his speech bubbles, and he makes really good use of these to tell lots of stories and jokes that are local to Arizona. So in addition to being influenced by visual forms and by the people who made them, these maps were also influenced by their corporate sponsors. We're going to start off with the National Park Service, which of course is not corporate, but we can't skip over the National Park Service because they commissioned so many amazing maps of the Grand Canyon. Like other truly corporate interests, they did this to stimulate interest in tourism. So they played a large sponsorship role. And a lot of national parks maps, like the 1957 one on the left, are useful, right? They get us around, and hopefully we don't have to have rangers come and fetch us because we got lost in the Grand Canyon. But some of them were commissioned to be decorative or collectible or just plain fun. Our good friend Ruth Taylor had some family connections with the National Parks Service. Her sister was married to an NPS official. Her brother Frank did a lot of freelancing, writing work with them. And she illustrated this book, Oh Ranger, a book about the national parks, which of course features the Grand Canyon as one of the iconic sites that you need to visit when you come tour America. Of course, you can't escape Fred Harvey at the Grand Canyon. You knew I was going to talk about Fred Harvey, I'm sure. His tourist services for the Santa Fe Railway are famous. We're looking at a 1928 map of the Indian detours on the right and a 1946 illustrated map of the Great Southwest on the left. We're going to come back to all of these maps when we talk about the stories that they're telling, so I'm not going to pause and describe them in detail, even though it's so tempting. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway released illustrated maps as well that weren't necessarily connected to Harvey at the very top level of their visual communication strategy. The map on the left is from 1956, and when you read the small print, it encourages tourists to visit the Grand Canyon, quote, the largest natural canyon in the world. I'm not sure that's what I would say about the Grand Canyon if that's the only phrase I were using to describe it. It's the biggest in the world, but that's the phrase they used. And then the 1950 map on the right emphasizes the, quote, enormous transportation system and tremendous network represented by Santa Fe's lines. And this is a recurring theme for a lot of the corporate sponsors. You can get where you need to go. You can arrive at the Grand Canyon because of our amazing transit networks that we have built for you and are offering to you at a wonderful low price. So while the Santa Fe emphasized the Grand Canyon as part of the Southwest, the Union Pacific included the canyon as part of a menu of great northwestern sites because, of course, they want you to stay at their tourist lodgings, which are on the North Rim. So the canyon is both the largest and the most southerly site available for Union Pacific. And they feature it on many of the maps that encourage you to travel throughout the West on the Union Pacific. Airlines, in addition to just flying over Arizona in general, often sponsored cartoon maps to encourage tourism. So this is a 1945 map for American Airlines, and it's emphasizing Americans' routes, of course, and shows how the route of the flagships connects you with other, perhaps lesser carriers and their routes. And it's really functional. It tells you where to go. It tells you time zones. Scale is marked, which is unusual for a cartoon map. And we have a ranger at Grand Canyon National Park. It's not really more important than any other sites on the map, but you can definitely get there traveling on Americans' flagships. This is Ruth Taylor White's 1939 map for United Airlines, and it is a little bit more focused on the Grand Canyon as part of this larger network of sites that you should absolutely see as you travel the United States as a tourist. This is a detail from a 1936 map drawn at Rand McNally for TWA, and it's clearly calling on Ruth Taylor's language of gay geography here. I haven't been able to track down exactly who at Rand McNally illustrated this map, but it's definitely cheerful with these chubby little cartoon characters and lots of labels and speech bubbles. It's calling on a lot of the formal features that we've already seen. You can get to the Grand Canyon by bus. So this is Greyhound's Good-Natured Map of the Colorful Southwest from 1939. And its small print tells us, Arizona holds much in store for you. You will not want to miss the side trip from Flagstaff to the Grand Canyon. Side trip to the Grand Canyon. It is impossible to convey in words the vastness, the beauty, the magnificence of this world-famous wonder. This is the National Trailways Bus System map from 1949. It's a little bit unusual because it's not showing us any roads, but occasionally we see a bus, so I guess we can travel by bus on roads to the Grand Canyon. And emphasis here is really on human interaction with the site. So we're looking at all of these maps because they show us how these systems that we're commissioning the maps are part of larger networks stretching across the country, encouraging Americans to see America first. And if we think about our historical timeline, these maps are published in an era characterized by patriotism after World War I, and then by thrift during the Depression years. So you're not going to hop a jet to Europe. You're going to see America first and tour your own country as an expression of national pride and as a money-saving strategy for a cheaper vacation, because Americans are practical, right? So as the interstate and highway systems developed and automobile ownership rose, touring around in your own car was also encouraged. That was kind of toward the end of the period that we're looking at here. And oil companies, of course, commissioned maps. Possibly you have some of these at home. My mom was telling me she had some when she was a kid, and then she threw them all out when she was cleaning her room at some point. I was like, Mom. she has many other great qualities. So the oil companies commissioned maps to boost travel, to establish themselves as a household name. I found this one in a thrift shop. My mom's great. She didn't ruin my life by throwing out her maps. And it's a pretty typical oil company map, right? It shows what we can see when we travel around at the Grand Canyon. Of course, we see the canyon, we see surrounding narratives. And that's what we're going to talk about with the rest of our time that I'm trying to keep track of closely here. So these stories frame the Grand Canyon for us, and as it turns out, the stories that they tell us about the Grand Canyon are pretty similar. So visually, we've seen a wide variety of images. The narratives that they craft for us, the stories that they tell, are pretty consistent across all of these visually diverse maps. And the first of these stories is easy access. So historically, of course, you get to the rim by horse. These are Santa Fe advertising images from earlier in the century. But by the time cartoon maps emerge in the 20s and the 30s, transportation at the canyon is no longer horse-drawn. The Santa Fe Railway had opened its branch railroad line in 1901. El Tovar opened in 1905. So by the time the cartoon maps come along, you jaunt over to the Grand Canyon by train or by bus on a network that spreads throughout Arizona and across the United States. Travel to and through the canyon is now, as we can see on the maps themselves, accomplished by train or bus or car. No matter where you are in America, you can hop a ride that takes you to the Grand Canyon. And once you're there, transportation networks are really clearly marked, again, as you now know, often because of corporate sponsorship, right? The commissioner of the map has a lot to do with how transportation of the canyon is pictorialized. You're going to see some famous sights while you're there. You can take your own personal car. You can take an airplane ride over the Grand Canyon. As with helicopter rides today, taking a biplane flight over the canyon on some of these maps is offered as a really great way to access views that are unreachable by wheeled vehicle or on foot. The Grand Canyon Airport opened to commercial flights in 1925. As we can see on Blood Goods map toward the right-hand side of your screen. And not all of these maps include flight as a transit option, but quite a lot of them do, and they're definitely about access to the scenery once you're there at the canyon. For those of you who prefer to stay on the ground and not ride around on top of a biplane, no worries. There's this really great, according to the maps, network of roads within the park that often show tourists enjoying the view from their car. In the upper left-hand corner, we're seeing Hayter and Hayter's 1932 map that emphasizes the busyness of the canyon and the crowds who flock there by depicting a traffic jam headed into the park. So this map was an illustration for a cartoon atlas of the United States, a little bit like Ruth Taylor's. As you can probably imagine, maps that were explicitly distributed, often by transit companies to encourage tourism, did not picture traffic jams. They just left that out of the narrative entirely. Once you're there, once you've escaped the traffic jam and you're tooling around at the canyon, how should you organize your travels and what are you supposed to do? Well, task number one is to enjoy the sublime views. John Wesley Powell had written about this in his 1895 edition of Exploration of the Colorado River and its Canyons. It's a famous quote, I'm sure you've heard it. The wonders of the Grand Canyon cannot be adequately represented in symbols of speech, nor by speech itself. The resources of the graphic arts are taxed beyond their powers in attempting to portray its features. Language and illustration combined must fail. And yet, it's the USGS that gives us what's probably the foundational image of white tourists enjoying the views at the Grand Canyon. This is Clarence Dutton's Panorama from Point Sublime, published in 1882, and I'm really hard-pressed to think of a cartoon map that doesn't essentially quote this image to us, just in a very different visual language. Tiny humans perch on the edge at the canyon, right? And they look at the awesome views, and they need to record their experience visually. So very early on in the canyon's life as a tourist destination, railway ads situated the activity of looking in a commercial context. The canyon is a living piece of art on Union Pacific's ad in the left. drinking it in as the primary activity that tourists are responsible for. And cartoon maps definitely adopt this visual language, and they play on this familiar trope in most of the images that we're seeing. So a lot of the maps will picture, as we're seeing here, tools for looking. We don't just look, we have special tools that help us to look at the Grand Canyon. We have cameras, we have easels, we have palettes. These artists are using art as a lens to frame a really specific way of encountering the Grand Canyon. So Don Bloodgood gives us photographers, Joe Mora shows us painters, Catherine Cahill includes an observer with a telescope pointed at the canyon. We are not looking here in the bottom left-hand corner at her Lowell Observatory image. We're looking at her Grand Canyon image, and the person here is using a telescope to zoom in. A lot of the maps show characters who are acting sort of like tour guides with their fellow tourists. This seems to be the case in the Humble Oil map on the top right. We're pointing out the beautiful views in the distance. Other characters just stand around and kind of gulp in wonder. So two of these maps, one by George Avey and one by Bob Petley, use the phrase, "Golly, what a gully." That's not what I said the first time I saw the Grand Canyon, but the thought is probably similar, right? Wow. Even Ruth Taylor White's mule deer, so if you look at the illustration in the bottom left-hand corner, even the mule deer is gazing in wonder at the canyon. And then the 1948 map on the top left, signed Smith, uses a speech bubble to emphasize, again, the smallness of humans and the grandness of the Grand Canyon. It's not as elegant as Dutton's panorama, but it really is expressing quite the same view. The message is the same. Of course, how to look isn't the only story that we're being told by these maps. Yes, there's easy access to sublime views, but there's also this narrative of the untamed wilderness. So on the south rim, mule trails dominate this untamed wilderness story. There are remote locations that are unreachable by car or other wheeled vehicle, and you have to access them by mule. So John Hance operated a hotel about 15 miles east of today's Grand Canyon Village, and he started advertising lodgings and mule rides in 1887. You know, of course, the Kolb brothers and their souvenir photo studio at Bright Angel Trail, taking snapshots of tourists on muleback starting around 1904. And then we have plucky tourists on all of these cartoon maps that are keeping this tradition alive for us. So we're seeing Joe Mora, Don Bloodgood, Reg Manning, Jolly Lindgren, and the 1936 TWA map here, and all of them show tourists taking mule rides. Sometimes the trails are barely there, and then, like the Jolly Lindgren map in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, sometimes they're really more like roads. I feel like even I could stay on a mule if we were riding on roads. At the North Rim, of course, hunting camps represent this idea of wild spaces. So North Rim tourists encounter wild animals and bed down in rustic lodgings. Evidently, they also get chased around by giant kaibab squirrels and angry buffalo. I got to skip this experience when I went to the Grand Canyon as well. Not so sorry about that. And as in real life, there are fewer visitors on the North Rim. It's a lot emptier, a lot more open, at least according to Don Bloodgood and Catherine Cahill, who we're looking at again here. Catherine Cahill's angry buffalo really scares me every time I look at it very closely. And this leads us to the last wilderness trope, which is that of empty space. So the enormity and the untouched beauty of the canyon is persistent throughout all of these maps as a visual motif. And here we're seeing Catherine Cahill, Jolly Lindgren, Fred Harvey, and the National Park Service, showing us that there are these vast swaths of untouched land, wild, completely void of human presence. But don't worry, if a rustic hunting cabin isn't really your cup of tea, all of these maps also highlight the desirable amenities available at the Grand Canyon. So somehow empty wilderness and luxury hotels are not at all incompatible, fear not. When construction of Bright Angel Lodge was announced, for instance, a 1903 newspaper in Globe had a lot to say about that magnificent edifice that will be 3 stories high and will afford every modern convenience. So both the Santa Fe and the Union Pacific Railroads made sure that the cartoon maps they commissioned were going to show us their luxury accommodations. For the Union Pacific, emphasis, of course, was on the Grand Canyon Lodge on the North Rim, which had opened in 1928, burnt down in 1932, was rebuilt on the same site in 1937. And for the Santa Fe, of course, the iconic destination was Harvey's El Tovar on the South Rim. And we're seeing lots of details from Joe Mora's map of the Grand Canyon, which, since Mora was kind of an independent observer, shows both of these famous destinations without discriminating between the two of them. But famous hotels and deluxe cabins, the only kind of cabin I would like to stay in, were featured on railway maps, like the two Harvey maps that are in this image, the blue one up top, and then the Grand Canyon El Tovar detail below it. But these same destinations made their way onto maps that weren't sponsored by the railways as well. So we're looking at details from other maps, Ruth Taylor, Tom Bloodgood, that you've already seen. And notice how all of these point out these famous hotels as tourist sites in and of themselves. Tourists should see them because they are part of the experience of visiting the Grand Canyon, part of the experience of that place. So for Harvey, you might even say that El Tovar really kind of equals the Grand Canyon typographically. That's certainly what's starting to happen here on this map. One of the most persistent stories that the maps tell is, of course, that of the timeless, what they call natives. So the Indian Detours map tells viewers that they will visit a land that is at once the last frontier and the home of an ageless antiquity. There's this idea that Native Americans will give presumably white tourists access to days gone by merely by their presence in the landscape. And we have ahistorical indigenous neighbors on every side of the canyon landscape. Ruth Taylor's 1929 cartograph of the Grand Canyon populates the region with Native American characters in traditional dress. Traditional architecture, craft, and costume are always on display adjacent to the Grand Canyon. And then the Hayters and Quinn in 1931, for their illustrated atlases in the top right corner, make sure that we experience the landscape of the canyon as an activity that's framed by and surrounded with indicators of authentic Native American culture. This is a 1927 Winslow Daily Mail newspaper item that's talking about a new curio store opened by Hopi Chief Joe Sakakura Yellowfeet soon after the arrival of 2 truckloads of curios from the Hopi Reservation. He would open his shop, and he plans, says the newspaper, to bring Indian workers to his establishment there to do their native weaving and other works of art for the benefit of the visitors. Later on, he intends also to produce Indian dances and other tribal ceremonies. So this emphasis on authentic native residents is an established visual narrative by the time the cartoon maps are introduced. Harvey, of course, had been marketing the idea of Indians at the Grand Canyon for a really long time, and indigenous culture is on display constantly throughout these maps, primarily as a way of providing, in the images at least, white tourists with access to native peoples and practices. So we have access to traditional craft. Visiting the Grand Canyon turns into a shopping trip as well as a way of learning about Native American cultures. Crafts are equivalent to souvenirs, and that's very apparent in a lot of the textual labels on a lot of these maps. And then, of course, performance turns up on many, many of the maps as well. More than simply being made, traditional crafts are performed, as we have seen, by the people who make them. And then we can also see Indigenous Americans performing identity through dance, through song, through culturally specific activities like weaving or pottery, even simply performing the idea of Native America as an object of passive observation, as in the Smith image in the center here, just by standing there, presumably for the white visitors to be able to gaze at their leisure. There's also this idea in the maps that Native Americans are living in the depths, that they're remote and unspoiled. Of course, they are living there. The Havasupai are portrayed as simple farmers and keepers of traditional lifeways on the maps. Jolly Lindgren, Reg Manning, Don Bloodgood, Catherine Cahill, Ruth Taylor White, all make this trope apparent in their maps. And Mora shows us cliff dwellers. They feel a little bit more Stone Age than anything else in his Cliff Dwellers Lament on the far right. And it's complicated, right? Because, of course, the Havasupai Reservation is at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and the Hopi and the Navajo do have rich traditions of weaving and textile production, and the Yavapai do have a strong and diverse heritage of dance, and all of these things show up on the maps. So one of the complicated things about them is that they really are quite carefully researched in a lot of their details, and they can be accurate in many ways, but at the same time they can also really flatten these experiences and treat them in a very ahistorical way, removing them from specificity or from contemporary culture or even from a very specific historical moment in space and time, and simply having the past as kind of this endless, undifferentiated, hazy, and yet beautifully illustrated moment. So one last example, of course, is how Native Americans keep watch in the cartoon maps, often at Desert View Watchtower, aka Indian Watchtower, and a lot of the maps pick up on this motif. Probably you already know the Watchtower was designed by Mary Coulter, finished in 1932, modeled on ancient Pueblo people's watchtowers, particularly the one at Hub and Leap National Monument. I'm not sure that we really have time for our bonus story of not falling in, but we're not talking about suicide, right? We're going to talk about that later. I won't talk about it. But this persistent motif of holding people back from the edge, I was kind of really surprised by this, and I found it really, really funny as I went along. There's lots of holding back from the edge, not leaning too far, don't fall in. It takes me back to childhood tourism activities with my dad, who was always afraid that one of us was going to fall over some ledge somewhere, and a couple of inches was enough to spark anxiety. We never visited the Grand Canyon as a family. But when I did visit there, I had this moment of, oh gosh, I can't get too close to the edge, I will fall in. It really turns up on a lot of these maps, but of course the canyon kitties never fall in. It's really exhausting that all of the grown-up white adults are about to just drop over the edge accidentally at any moment, but the canyon kitties are up to all sorts of hijinks right on the edge, and they're never scared and they never fall in. So as we wrap up, my question looking at these maps is always, why should we even care? Why bother? And my argument is that these maps have left us with a visual legacy, right? So when we look at more contemporary maps, like the one on the left by Boyd Ament from 1983, his tourist and mileage map, a 1991 map by Blaine K. Stevens on the top right, and then a vintage postcard reprint that you can still buy in gift shops, we can see that we have inherited these visual vocabularies from the past, and we keep on playing out these narratives. And it might be time to pause and reflect and see if there are ways to broaden those narratives in any way, to be more inclusive, or to ask ourselves difficult questions about contemporary issues of land use or resource management or tourism at the Grand Canyon. Not all of the persistent motifs are this serious. We can see on the left there's now a fence around the Grand Canyon to keep us from falling in, so it's safe to go there, you won't fall in. These visual tropes continue to persist. You can find, buy, be given maps that are still drawing on this visual language as you tour around Arizona, as I'm sure you know because you're in Arizona. So you can pick up maps like these in many locations. And this visual heritage continues to influence folks who are producing maps today. So Explorer Maps, we're looking at a detail of their beautiful map here, specifically draws attention to their images as hand-drawn and historicist. They're not stock. They feel a little bit old-timey, and that's part of their appeal. They're clearly drawing on the formal visual language of the past that we've been looking at together, and these maps are repeating the stories that we've been telling ourselves about the Grand Canyon since we first started touring it. Nostalgia can be a really powerful tool that prompts us to think fondly of the good old days. But I think we have to ask ourselves at some point exactly what we're nostalgic for. Are there parts of that story that we might need to reconsider, or that we need to stop repeating as we move forward into the future? These are really big questions, and I am not in any way suggesting that the cartoon maps we've seen today are going to answer them for us. Those are complex questions and even more complex answers, but maybe these images can prompt us to start asking those questions. So thanks for hanging out with me and hearing this story about cartoon maps of the Grand Canyon. You can get in touch with me if you want to know more about any specific image. Thanks, folks. So I did kind of a bad job of timing, but maybe we have time for questions if anyone has them.
Your bad job.
Okay.
I would say that's great job.
Oh, okay.
That's ahead of schedule for the coordinator. That's great. So we have some time. That was a wonderful presentation. So if you guys have some questions, let's dive in.
Or if you want to see a specific image again because I advanced too quickly for you to read it.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
great.
Specifically, Joe Mora's story is, as a young artist, and this is a comment, but I wonder if you, in your research, knew that he painted, and he lived among the Hopi and painted very detailed images of Katsina dancers, not cartoons, but
Right, yeah,
people.
as a painter and a sculptor.
Yeah, and they were, at some point, too much detail, and they went into the archives at the Museum in Northern Arizona and elsewhere, and he made this transition in the 1920s to cartooning, and you mentioned his accurate portrayal. One of the things he and others portrayed was the snake dance, which began to trivialize it to the point where the Hopis said no more visitors to the snake dance, and I think I saw you thought it was a Hopi male weaver. I double-checked that.
Well, in Hopi land.
Yeah, but it was also next to Navajo land. So
yes.
I just love the detail, and thank you so much. And I just wanted to share
Mora's
that
research
information.
process was just really, really deep. So a lot of that came through in his maps.
Oh, one right there. Hi, Dori.
Hi.
It was wonderful. Since this is sponsored in part by the ASU Library, I wanted to ask you, where did you find all of these wonderful images? And will you talk a little bit about, the role of research libraries and archives and where you had to hunt to find these?
Yes. So the wonderful librarians at ASU, both while I was writing my dissertation and while I was putting this talk together, very generously hooked me up with some wonderful high-resolution scans of various items in the collection. And then the other thing that I would encourage for those of you who maybe want to look in more detail is the David Rumsey, R-U-M-S-E-Y, map collection. Is it housed at Stanford now? Is that where it physically ended up? Yes, so another university library, but that one is open access online. They're all Zoomable. You too can go there and zoom in to look at the tiniest detail. And without librarians, every time I go to a new city, every time I move to a new university, my first point of contact is my librarian, because without them, the work cannot happen.
Your distinction, if there is any, between cartoon maps and pictorials, which you did not mention that term.
That's a really tricky line to navigate, and I had a lot of philosophical arguments with myself as I put this presentation together, and sort of decided to spare you all that conversation I had with my cat about the difference between pictorial maps and cartoon maps. I tried to zoom in and concentrate on the ones that had, speech bubbles, labels, the roundedness of cartoon characters. I think a lot of maps tread that really fine line. So I was trying to focus today on a very rough and non-scholarly definition that's basically maps that tell jokes. Please don't quote me in print, because that's not a very great scholarly definition. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. They do. So there are a lot of companies creating cartoon maps or pictorial maps in a contemporary context, and these tourist maps can be very, very highly detailed, but unfortunately, as you point out so rightly, a lot of times they're quoting the same narratives as their source material. So when I teach these maps, usually one of the first things we do is exactly what we did today. We pause to talk about what stories they are telling, what caricatures they are putting forward, what tired old narratives they're asking us to still buy into, and we approach them both in terms of appreciating them for their level of detail and research, and then also to critique them for the stories that they continue to tell, and to ask ourselves, maybe in our classrooms, there's the person who will be the next Joe Mora or the next Ruth Taylor. I live in hope, at any rate.
Yeah, great presentation. Thanks again, Dori. I noticed that on some of the maps, there's a representation of what the surrounding landscape is for. And there was one map by Avey, I think was his last name, Avey,
George Avey.
Which showed a lot of ranching, grazing,
Let's see if we can get back there.
hunting. And if you can find it, there was a representation of a park ranger there.
Yes.
And the park ranger had his arms folded and a stern look on his face.
Yes.
Don't come in here.
He's policing that landscape.
A great contrast to the cartoon map you showed by Manning, which had that sort of super welcoming, friendly, hand up in the air, come on in, park ranger.
Yeah, there he is.
There he is. Yeah. None of the other ones had a park ranger like that, but
yeah, all of the other rangers are really, really cheerful fellows, but this one's a little bit scary. I noticed that, and I didn't really know what to make of it. It was a little bit baffling, but maybe he's worried that we're going to fall in. I don't know.
Well, if you look at all the other people, there's an awful lot of resource users, and there's a conflict.
Yeah.
There's a long historical conflict between the resource industries and the people dependent on those resource industries and the Park Service, which they think is locking up lands and keeping people out. And so that's what I see reflected.
That's a really interesting observation, and I will now go home and track down all sorts of other things that I could look at to think about that further, yeah.
One contemporary cartoon map producer is Tom Lamb,
Okay.
L-A-M-B, and he's done maps in basically the 2000s and contemporary, so you can look him up. But I cataloged a map of the Los Feliz area of Los Angeles, and my colleague said, "Oh, look, there's my apartment. It even has the umbrellas."
I will be headed back to my hotel room tonight to look into him as well.
I didn't see anything by Bob Waldmeyer. Did he do nothing of the Grand Canyon? He's the famous cartoon map maker for Route 66.
I have not found anything by Waldmeyer yet, but the search continues.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everybody. I had a great time. I hope you did too.